with Norfolk Southern and its predecessor, Conrail, since 1986. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman, valued Shippers Trade Association members, rail consultants, and colleague railroads, allow me first to state that Oil Creek and Titusville Lines has no fundamental disagreement with a surcharge as a method of recovering dramatic, unpredictable, and material increases in fuel and other costs. The imposition of a surcharge is far better than the destruction of service quantity or quality to prevent the failure of the carrier's enterprise. However, since the tariff, contract, or exempt quotation is frequently adjusted every 6 to 12 months in our experience, and it may contain an RCAF adjustment provision, the surcharge should be related only to those price changes which are in fact dramatic, unpredictable, and in excess of the contractual mechanism's ability to make the carrier whole. The surcharge must not continue to be used to enhance a carrier's profit at a time of tight capacity and unusual traffic demands. This goes beyond being a mere misnomer and is, in our opinion, an unreasonable practice. As we understand Norfolk Southern's most recent public announcement, they appropriately recognize the foregoing. Furthermore, they realize that the index they use for calculating the surcharge must be contemporaneous with the time frame for which the quoted price was to be in effect. Hopefully, in addition, they recognize that our shippers may not operate in a protected, franchised environment such as that which the railroads enjoy. Thus, the shippers cannot pass on cost as easily, and therefore profiteering through an exorbitant fuel surcharge is unnecessarily and unwisely beating up on our shippers. Finally, all billing carriers have the right to adjust their cost recovery methods on through rates, but they must divide the additional revenue amongst all carriers in the route who have participated in the rate making. To do otherwise is profiteering by the billing carrier at the expense of the carrier which actually incurred its share of those increased costs but did not receive its rightful revenue from the surcharge. This is the status of the current relationship between Oil Creek and Titusville Lines and Norfolk Southern, despite our numerous and repeated attempts to rectify this unfair arrangement with them. This practice is an unreasonable practice designed either to coerce Oil Creek and Titusville Lines as a short line carrier into a new and different accounting relationship which is not in our best interest, or to profit Norfolk Southern as the collecting carrier by recovering funds as a fuel surcharge on fuel they did not burn. Conclusion: in either case, Oil Creek and Titusville Lines respectfully ask the Surface Transportation Board to redress this unreasonable practice upon complaint. Thank you for your time and for your attention to this important matter.
Thank you very much, sir. Any questions, Frank?
Norfolk Southern then imposes fuel surcharges on traffic that you originate or terminate.
That's correct.
They share none of those increased fuel costs with you.
That's correct.
And that's because you've negotiated that in your contract with them, that you agreed to that in the contract? Or
no, did we not? We did not agree to that in the contract.
That's just
Norfolk Southern deals with the handling line connecting short lines, which is a class of accounting arrangement that they have. I understand that they share and have a mechanism to share fuel surcharges with those carriers. Oil Creek and Titusville Lines is one of 3 or 4 junction settlement carriers that were with Conrail that are now with Norfolk Southern. And as I understand it, those that have not converted do not share in any fuel surcharge. I see no reason why, since we participate in the rate making, since we burn the fuel, that we are not eligible to participate in that. Regardless of the level or the method of calculation of the surcharge, if it is applied to the rate, and the rate applies to the entire rate for the through route, then we are entitled to it. And I think that this gives prima facie, if you will, evidence that it is an unreasonable practice, may be very small, affecting a very small railroad, but is unreasonable. The fact of beating up on our shippers is a point which I make to say that if we're going to increase prices dramatically in a time of tight capacity, we have to step to the plate when we negotiate the rates and say so. In my opinion, and I've sat here and listened to the presentations that have been given so eloquently by my good colleagues, they have used the fuel surcharge as a quick way to profit from the tight capacity to raise a lot of money. Appreciate that. Whether it's right or wrong, I leave to others, but I want our share.
He sounds especially like somebody else in the railroad business who I won't mention right now, but always looking for the share of all the participants. What if you were to just convert to the other accounting system? Would that be terribly burdensome? It would give you the right to...
It doesn't give you the right to participate in setting and negotiating the rate. You present to Norfolk Southern a category of rate for a broad category of commodities. We like to be able to negotiate rates with the Class 1s that connect for new customers. And we've been successful at that. We have published the rates because we can do it quickly when the Norfolk Southern and the other connecting carriers give us permission to do so. So we do this as a form of active marketing. We think that the handling line status disrupts that ability. Now, I might say we have another railroad that I own, New York and Lake Erie Railroad, that connects with CSX at Buffalo, among others. And CSX has many junction settlement carriers, and they do automatically divide the surcharge revenue with those carriers, so they have no issue.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
We'll take a 15-minute break. Be back in 15 minutes. We were thinking we might have to order a dinner at some point. Okay. The last panel this afternoon will be Escalation Consultants Incorporated, Snavely King, Majors, O'Connor, and Lee, Transportation Economics, Inc., High Ground Consulting Limited, and Freight Resources Network, LLC. Thank you very much for coming today. We're anxious to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Okay.
You may proceed.
Chairman Buttry, Vice Chairman Mulvey, my name is Jay Roman from Escalation Consultants, and I once again appreciate the opportunity to present to the board. My written testimony in this proceeding dealt with all the differences there are that make the fuel surcharge program very distant from the actual fuel costs the railroads incur. And the analysis that we've done of the railroads' fuel surcharge programs demonstrate that those differences are contributing to the railroads recovering more than their increase in fuel expense. But after sitting through this hearing all day, I can appreciate the difficulty of the board because you have shippers and consultants up here saying that the railroads are over-recovering, and you have the railroads saying, boy, we're not recovering enough, we need to get more. My testimony is going to try to simplify this issue. And to do that, I'd like to start with really how fuel surcharges work. Fuel surcharges are applied against the total revenue for a movement. They're applied against rates. And the reason they're applied against rates is to generate an amount of revenue for the railroad to cover their increases in fuel expenses. So you have fuel surcharges applied against rates to accumulate money for the railroads to cover expenses. So this relationship between fuel expenses and in revenue is extremely important because that's what these surcharges do. They're applied against revenue to cover expenses. I'd like to focus my testimony on what is happening with the railroads as far as this relationship of fuel expenses in relation to revenue. What it was back before these fuel surcharges were actually generating any revenue and what it is now, to see if the railroads are in a better position right now with fuel costs as a percentage of expenses than they were back in the 2001 time frame when these surcharges weren't really generating any money. And to do that, what I'd like to do, if this button works, here I'm looking at Norfolk Southern. And in the fourth quarter of 2001, fuel cost as a percentage of revenue were 6.27%, just dividing fuel expenses by their revenue. In the fourth quarter of 2005, I'm doing a comparable calculation. Only during this time period, if you actually calculated their fuel expenses divided by revenue, you would get a percentage below the 11.68% I have there. Because what I'm solving for is what fuel expenses would be as a percentage of revenue to the railroads without any fuel surcharge revenue. So what I'm doing with their revenue in the fourth quarter of 2005, I'm saying, okay, let's get rid of any revenue associated with fuel surcharges, and to do that, I'm deflating their revenue by their average fuel surcharge in the fourth quarter of 2005, which is 16.7%. I am lowering their revenue.
This is coming right out of the financial statements.
That is correct.
Public documents.
Public documents.
Okay.
Now,
we may stop you, every one of you, in the middle of this, because we're not going to do your questions like we normally do. So the rest of you can be ready for questions at any time.
would appreciate it.
Good.
The 16.7%, I'm deflating their revenue when I divide this lower amount of revenue into the same expenses, the percentage increases of fuel expenses as a percentage of revenue. So when I go between the fourth quarter of 2001 to the fourth quarter of 2005, I show that fuel expenses as a percentage of revenue increased 5.41%. Now what that 5.41% represents, it is the amount that if you apply it to the railroad's revenue in the fourth quarter of 2005, they would be no better off and no worse off as to fuel costs as a percentage of revenue than they were in the fourth quarter of 2001. This 5.41% is substantially below their 16.7% fuel surcharge. The difference is 11.29%. And what I've entitled that is recovery above fuel costs, because if they recover 16.7% on all their revenue, they would be in a better position in the fourth quarter of 2005 than they would be in the fourth quarter of 2001. Now, from analyzing all these surcharge programs, what we find is that when these programs were initiated, you had a price per barrel of oil at $23 or $25 per barrel. And maybe there were some problems associated with these programs then, but they were very small problems. But as oil prices went from $25 to $30 to $40 to $50 to $60 to $70 per barrel, these small problems have started to accumulate to be larger problems. And what we find from the analysis that we've performed of the railroads is that recovery above fuel cost has increased over time as the price of fuels increased.
So it's like compound interest, if you will. Is it like compound interest?
If you have a problem with low oil prices, it compounds and becomes a bigger problem with high oil prices. Yes, sir. Oops. This is not letting me forward.
He's up in the booth. He'll come down.
Is he coming?
Is he coming down?
Is he coming down?
How about this one, Jay?
No, he said this one wouldn't work, so I'm paging up.
Are we get some assistance? Let's ask another question while we're waiting.
All right.
You've used NS as an example here.
That's correct.
Is it safe for us to assume, I mean, the board to assume that those numbers to some extent approximate the numbers that would be true for the other carriers, or is NS unique in some way that would keep it from being very similar to the other carriers?
In my testimony, I'm going to be giving this calculation of recovery above fuel costs for all the major U.S. and Canadian railroads.
So you're going to give them all? Okay, I thought you were just being illustrative of what the situation was.
I will take Norfolk Southern through the total time period, and then I'll give the results for the other other railroads.
Okay.
When you reduce fuel revenues by the fuel surcharge, how do you calculate the total fuel surcharge against total revenues?
I'm simply taking their revenue and I'm dividing it by 1.167% to deflate it by assuming that everyone is getting that fuel surcharge and deflating the revenue.
You're assuming that everyone is paying the fuel surcharge, though.
That is correct.
So that somewhat overstates it.
But if everyone is not collecting, this percentage of 11.68% would actually be lower. So the over-recovery would be greater because I wouldn't be deflating it by as much.
Okay.
Okay. No. I'm pressing the arrows over here? Okay. Thank you. This graph is showing over time what our calculations are for Norfolk Southern. The blue line with a box on it is simply, the green line with the diamond on it is showing what Norfolk Southern's fuel surcharge is each quarter between the fourth quarter of 2001 and the fourth quarter of 2005. It's just putting out there what their surcharge is. This bluish line with a box on it is called recovery above fuel cost. I've gone through the same calculation I had in the previous illustration each quarter for Norfolk Southern and tracked it against the fuel surcharge. Now, from an analyst standpoint, when you look at a graph like this, the first thing you say is, I better go back and check my numbers. Because this is essentially showing that recovery above fuel costs, and the way I'm calculating it here, is pretty much the same as the railroad's total fuel surcharge out through the latter part of 2004. When you go back and you check the numbers for why that's happening, this is what you find. I've added a line to this graph. It is this green line with a diamond on it. This line is reflective of the fuel cost as a percentage of revenue. It is this calculation. What is fuel cost as a percentage of revenue? And it's showing that when you divide revenue into fuel costs each quarter, it didn't really change for Norfolk Southern until we got out to the year of 2005. So if fuel cost as a percentage of revenue hasn't changed, then it's a question of what is the fuel surcharge. And what I've entitled it here is recovery above fuel cost. Now, I think it's kind of interesting to talk about this line right here. Fuel cost as a percentage of revenue. Why would that be staying the same over this whole time frame? We've heard lots of testimony in here today about some of the reasons it would stay the same. Railroads use hedging. I mean, they try to minimize the upward increases in fuel costs that they're subject to. They institute policies and procedures. When fuel costs go up, you try to use less fuel costs. You try to buy more fuel when it's low and buy less fuel when it's high. But you also cannot ignore the fact that another thing that will keep fuel costs as a percentage of revenue the same is if the railroads are recovering a lot of their fuel costs in their rates. Because when you divide fuel cost by revenue, the higher the amount of revenue, the more rate increases they get, the more downward pressure there is on this calculation of fuel cost as a percentage of revenue. It's simply the long division. The higher the denominator, the lower the result that you're going to get. And in this case, we have fuel cost as a percentage of revenue not changing out through the latter part of 2004. Now, when we look at this, for the other major U.S. and Canadian railroads, all these numbers here are based on as if the railroads had the carload fuel surcharge for all of their movements, which isn't really going to be the case. All these changes represent what's happened between the fourth quarter of 2001 and the fourth quarter of 2005, just like the illustration I put up first with Norfolk Southern. And it shows the Canadian Pacific had the highest revenue recovery above fuel costs at 12.1%. Well, we know Canadian Pacific revised their fuel surcharge in January of 2006, so they'll no longer be the highest one here as we come out to the next quarter. The lowest one here is Union Pacific, with a revenue recovery above fuel cost at 1.8%. But I'd have to preface the Western U.S. railroads here, it would be wonderful to have some additional information here to true up these calculations, because we have calculated all this revenue recovery above fuel costs based upon their carload surcharge program. As it was stated here today, their fuel surcharges, for instance, for coal, are much higher than they are under their carload program. As an example, in December of 2005, the surcharge program for coal was about 7% higher than their carload fuel surcharge programs. So as we get actual numbers from the revenue for the actual fuel surcharge revenue they collect and true these things up, we think these lower over-recovery numbers here will probably increase. But I'd like to talk about going out into the future and recommendations. The way fuel surcharges are applied, they're applied against revenue to get an amount of money to cover fuel expenses. This is a very relevant calculation to be determining how these surcharges are actually performing. And what we would recommend that they submit the following information to the STB to help the STB better understand what is actually happening here. To submit their total fuel expense. They already do these type of things. Their total freight revenue. The revenue collected from all their fuel surcharge programs. Calculation of fuel cost as a percentage of revenue. And by that I mean total fuel expense divided by total freight revenue less fuel surcharge revenue. And then would request that they submit these calculations quarterly for the previous 4 years. Now, what this will do, what the advantages of this are, is it would provide an easy-to-use measure that would enable the board and other interested parties to evaluate whether a railroad's fuel surcharge program is reasonable. I think the board needs to have something. We've been talking here all day, and we have a tale of two cities in this room. You need to have data that you can really evaluate how these programs are performing. It requires minimal added reporting by the railroads. They already submit most of this information. The information we're really interested in is the revenue they're recovering from their fuel surcharges. It would provide a method for eliminating the 4 years of fuel escalation railroads are currently receiving under their current fuel surcharge programs. I envision this could be used as an index. You could have an index for each railroad where you could be taking a current rate and you could be adjusting it by this index, which would be reflective of how effective this program actually is. Last but not least, this is a very relevant calculation for fuel surcharges that are applied against the rate for a movement. Being as these surcharges are applied against revenue to generate an amount of money to cover expenses, these calculations are probably one of the best ways of determining how these surcharges are actually performing and how closely related they are to the railroad's actual changes in cost. We've heard a lot of different numbers in here today, and I think it would be important to focus on the bottom line as to how these programs are actually performing. That concludes my testimony. I thank you for once again being able to present to the board.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Doc?
Go right ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Good to be here today. Thank you, Chairman Buttry, Vice Chairman Mulvey, and staff. My name's Tom O'Connor. I'll be summarizing highlights of the presentation that Kim Hillenbrand and I submitted in testimony. And we're going to come to a similar conclusion that Jay offered you just a few minutes ago. What we were hearing today is a fairly easily solved problem, and it's solved by the availability of the data. We'll conclude with a recommended action plan, and the recommended action plan spells out the data that we believe would solve the problem that is before you today. We are testifying in conjunction with the American Chemistry Council. This slide reiterates some of the points made by Tom Schick in his earlier testimony, and I'll just expand on one or two of those as we go through. We talked a little bit about how would fuel surcharges be properly applied to specific movements. And point of fact, in Canada, they have used off and on since 1926 a formula called the Davis formula, which takes account of things which you heard from one of the Canadian witnesses earlier today, takes account of speed, weight, distance, gradient, and the like. It's an engineering kind of approach to the problem, but what that concept is speaking to is the fact that it's a useful approach, and we have it included in our testimony and our recommendation to link to a service unit. And which exact service unit you link to and how you link to it remains to be debated, but linking to it is important. Fuel surcharges lack transparency. The data collection will solve that problem. It will solve that problem. Now, in the course of the day, I'm not sure I recorded every recommendation for solving the lack of transparency, but I heard it from auto, coal, lumber, a few more shippers. I heard it finally from UP. UP wanted something that was transparent. The Class 1 railroad fuel surcharges all share a fatal flaw. And the fatal flaw you've heard about earlier today, and you've heard about it from practically every shipper witness. The flaw is we're applying a cost increase percentage to a revenue factor. We're really doing pricing when you take that approach. That's differential pricing, not cost recovery. It's differential pricing. When we are going to apply revenue as the base, we recover costs differently among commodities. That's a rate problem. We recover costs differently among industries. That's a broader problem. And ultimately, we over-recover fuel costs. And we'll probably over-recover fuel costs on all of the movements that are exhibiting a revenue cost ratio greater than the average for the year, roughly 140. You might even be over-recovering fuel costs from everything that's got an RCR greater than 100. But you are definitely over-recovering differentially. Now, the Class 1 railroads fuel surcharge is similarly flawed. We're looking at 5 of them, U.S. ones, as we go forward, and they all share that same flaw. This graph indicates part of the reason why the railroads might resist the use of RCAF. What are we looking at here? We're looking at fuel cost as a percentage of operating cost. Notice 2 things here. First of all, the fuel cost as a percentage of operating cost varies significantly among the railroads, and it varies significantly within a railroad through time. The RCAF weights that you heard about earlier today will be stable in terms of at a given time you'll have the same weight for fuel for all of the applications of the RCAF, whether adjusted for productivity or not adjusted for productivity, for all carriers, all shipments. What you're looking at is the fact that fuel impacts them differently. Okay? Now, this graph also shows you one thing, too. It focuses on the annual changes in fuel costs. And we'll take a look at those on the next graph. Here's the 2005 average fuel surcharge compared to the 2005 change in fuel cost. Now, the difference between those two parameters is a rough measure of over-recovery. You can see that all of them, by this measure, are over-recovering. The source of this data, parenthetically, are the railroad's SEC filings and the company websites, and it jumps right out at you. This data should be available through the STB, and much of it already would be available, reported in some format to the STB.
Tom,
Right.
why would be change in fuel cost as a percent of total cost instead of just the percent change in fuel cost? Because total cost would also increase, wouldn't they? And wouldn't that lower the the change in fuel cost as a percent of total cost as labor and other costs increase also?
Yeah, total costs can be moving in, during that same time period. But what this is telling you, we're back on the previous slide. What this is telling you is that as we move from 2004 to 2005, fuel really got to be a serious problem. And look at the NS. We looked at NS in Jay's data. For NS in 2005, fuel was roughly 11%. NS is not doing too bad when you have an RCAF that's at 12%, 10, 12%. But 10 or 12% is not going to be welcomed by BN, for whom fuel is 19%, nor UP, for whom fuel is 20%. That's the kind of a problem that you get into with the RCAF. As long as RCAF stays as a national figure, it's kind of a structural problem here. There is another thing, too, to bear in mind. There is an all-inclusive index, less fuel. The all-inclusive index, less fuel, until fairly recent years, I want to say partway through 2004, 2005, and beyond, if you graph it, and we don't have this particular graph in this particular presentation, but if you graph it, you'll see that the RCAF less fuel and the RCAF including fuel track very closely together. In 2004, and certainly in 2005 and beyond, they begin to diverge. When they begin to diverge, this kind of a problem with fuel and fuel cost recovery is going to be a typical problem that you're going to be hearing about from both railroads and shippers. It's a structural problem. Okay, now this graph we just looked at. Let's go back to page 4. Just take a quick look at page 4, and now let's go to page 6. That's the difference in cost. This is the fuel surcharge. It is utterly impossible for that cost difference to be run against this fuel surcharge uniformity, and somebody is not recovering a different amount. That's mathematically impossible. Now, the fuel surcharges claimed by BN and UP are virtually identical. The fuel surcharges claimed by KCS, NS, and CSXT are also virtually identical. There is, of course, a difference between the eastern carriers and the west. And KCS joined the eastern carriers in roughly the end of 2004. But that's an amazing graph. Here is what we were able to piece together, and Kim gets most of the credit for coming up with this data. This data was pieced together out of SEC filings. This data should be available for every railroad at the periodicity that you want, and when you have this data available, all of the ambiguities and uncertainties about whether there's an over-recovery or an under-recovery will disappear. We take line 1, the 2005 fuel costs, line 2, the 2004 fuel costs, line 3 is simply the difference. That's the increase in fuel costs as submitted to the SEC, really should be submitted to STB. That's the increase in fuel costs. That's the amount that one would expect a surcharge to recover. Some of the railroads, BN and NS and UP, we were able to identify an amount of fuel surcharge revenue that they reported. Most of this is direct. Some of it came indirectly through Wall Street analyst reports. It should be coming from the STB. This is a simple piece of information. And with this piece of information, all the ambiguity goes away. You've got the facts. You've already got the principle. It's be reasonable. Then you'll have the facts. Then you're there. It's solved. Okay. The next slide, I would submit that the Class 1 railroad's fuel surcharge structure is unsupported, certainly unsupported on data that's been provided or we've been able to come up with or we heard here today. And it appears to be structurally inequitable. I would submit further that practice is almost by definition unreasonable. Similar shipments transported in the same train can and do pay vastly different fuel surcharges. We submitted that in evidence. No need to dwell on it here. Anybody could come and replicate that same analysis. You would get exactly the same result. Central city to central city, different commodities, different revenue, different fuel surcharge. Everything else is the same. Here's the plan that we would recommend for your consideration. First, require uniform railroad reporting of railroad fuel costs. Not a big deal. They're counting it. It's there. The relevant fuel surcharge measure is the change in fuel cost. Not the total, but the change. And the definition of the base period becomes critical. It is definitely not 2001, as we heard a couple of times here today. It is not 2001. For both the base period and the subsequent period, fuel cost will be related, we'd recommend, to a simple and readily measured service unit. Revenue ton miles comes to mind. There are lots of others that could work. The railroads would also report the actual fuel surcharge revenues they collect during each period. And they would distinguish, this is important, they would distinguish the non-fuel surcharge traffic from the fuel surcharge traffic, so we wouldn't be guessing about it. Now, where did I get that idea? I got that idea from the announcement that CSX made in 2000 when they announced their first fuel surcharge. And it was authored by our current Secretary of the Treasury, who was then president of CSX. But that's his idea. I think it's a good idea. And he said that was the way he would apply the fuel surcharge. He would not apply a fuel surcharge to traffic to which it should not be applied. He defined as part of that traffic RCAF traffic, RCAF adjusted traffic, and traffic that had a contract. Then we go to step 5, comparisons of the fuel costs incurred and the fuel revenues received becomes a simple matter of arithmetic. Whether you have an overcharge or an undercharge, you can then correct it in the following period, be that a month or a quarter. This is very similar to the RCAF forecasting adjustment that is automatic. I mean, they do their best at the RCAF forecast, and as you know from looking at the RCAF forecast, it has never been right. I don't think there's a single quarter it's ever been right in its history. That's the way forecasts are. So you have an adjustment. Once you got the actual data, you look at the actual data, and you apply a forecast correction. That is our recommendation. And we appreciate the opportunity to be before you, and we may even finish close to on time. Thank you. This is I am Kim is the co-author of this. He's allowing me to speak here, but he's the co-author.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Chairman Buttry, Vice Chairman Mulvey, and board staff members. The view is quite different from this side of the dais, I must say, and it's good to see you all again.
It's good to see you, too.
Thank you. As you know, my name is Mazhar Ali Awan, and I am a managing director at Transportation Economics, a consulting group that assists electric utilities and other shippers understand how transportation and regulatory issues affect their businesses. Aside from litigation support, Transportation Economics has helped shippers with plant siting studies, cost analysis for various rail movements, project feasibility analyses, and other types of economic research and forecasting. Much of what I wanted to cover today has already been covered by other speakers, so I'm going to leave out a lot of that portion and yield back the balance of my time. Let me start by saying that railroads are entitled to cover their fuel expenses. I don't think a single shipper today has said to the contrary. Moreover, railroads should be free to bear as much or as little risk as they want with regard to changes in fuel prices. Traditionally, railroads have accomplished this through at least 3 different mechanisms. The first one, escalation clauses in contracts, hedging programs, and the third one being fuel surcharges. Escalation charges are based on some factor of rail costs and allow railroads to recoup fuel expenses. Of course, if prices drop, the savings are passed along to the shippers. Hedging inevitably raises the expected fuel price. There is a cost to be paid for the benefit of smoothing out price volatility. In addition, any hedging program carries with it a small but a very real risk of a rogue trader, a trader who guesses wrong and then doubles up his bets and potentially single-handedly wipes out the firm. Hedging programs used in conjunction with fuel surcharges are more worrisome and really are a double dipping. But actually, the more you think about it, they're really a triple dipping or a triple recovery of fuel expenses. Ideally, a hedging program would be effective or prudent only where a carrier did not have recourse to adjusting rates to accommodate added fuel expense. I've traveled much in the last year since leaving the board, year and a half since leaving the board, and aside from service concerns, the biggest concern that shippers have had throughout the country has been the fuel expenses that the fuel surcharge expense that they've been forced to bear. I think the questions that the board really needs to ask itself and the shipping community and the railroads are: what is a proper fuel surcharge? 2, under what circumstances would a fuel surcharge become an unreasonable practice? And 3, what can the board do to facilitate private sector initiatives to develop an appropriate fuel surcharge mechanism? Let me begin by saying that a fuel surcharge ought to be a pass-through mechanism of additional fuel expenses, and that's unexpected changes in fuel expenses. So surcharges that capture more revenue than the totality of a movement's fuel costs are really not a surcharge. An appropriate fuel surcharge is a pass-through mechanism, not a clawback mechanism. A mechanism that captures more revenue than the change in fuel price is implicitly and surreptitiously a rate increase. An appropriate fuel surcharge should capture the change in fuel prices from a common starting point. It makes little sense to ask a shipper who has built a new plant to pay a 15% fuel surcharge when they haven't moved anything yet. Stepping back for a second, I think this whole problem with the fuel surcharge and the reason why you hear so much outcry about this and concern from both the railroads and the shipping community is really an information asymmetry problem. The board can very easily change this. There have been other shippers during the day who've recommended that we go to SEC filings and require the railroads to file additional data. I don't think that needs to be really done, and I'm going to explain that more fully in a minute. The board requires the railroads to file R1 statements every year, and in those R1 statements is an expense for fuel, is a category for fuel expenses. So the board already has the data it needs to determine what the fuel expense for the various railroads have been for the previous year. And the board processes these R1 statements that the railroad submits into its Uniform Rail Costing System, the IRCS costing system. And the data exists within the phase two part of the IRCS costing system. Now, the board can very easily change this asymmetry problem by tweaking the phase 3 program, which the board sells to all interested parties at a nominal expense. I think it's $50, so there's a plug for the board's IT department. And really change the dynamic of what people are talking about out in the industry. So with these changes in the IRC system that we've proposed, and which I'll explain a little bit more in a minute, this information will allow shippers to really assess the surcharges that they believe are either onerous. They can use this information to find out that, in fact, they are reasonable. And at the same time, the carriers can use this data to determine whether their fuel surcharges are too high, and effectively they would have to explain to the shippers why their fuel surcharges are so high. So it really changes the dynamic of the conversation going out in the private sector by providing the industry more information. Now, in my written statement, in Transportation Economics written statement, we've enunciated 5 principles that the board should employ in assessing fuel surcharges, and I won't repeat those here in the interest of time. What I did want to do was, I know that Tom did an excellent job showing you the macro level of the effect of fuel costs on railroads and the surcharges that they've imposed and the difference between the two. And I think in keeping with the National Rail Transportation Policy, which really states that the board should allow the private sector to function as much as possible on its own without interference from the board, we really need to look at a micro-analysis to see which shippers are really being affected and how do we remedy those particular instances. Transportation Economics was asked by High Road Consulting to apply IRCs to nearly 24 movements, to isolate fuel costs associated with these movements, and to compare these expenses to fuel surcharges applied to these shippers. And we did this, and we didn't have to go to the SEC filings to get this data. All we did was look into the IRCs figures that the board reports at the end of the year, or usually around September every year, for each of the rail carriers. And if you look through the IRCs tables, and they're voluminous, almost 400 pages per railroad, you can go through the tables and you can find the unit costs associated with each one of the elements that one would think would contribute to fuel expense. And those elements are actually identified in the IRCs program through the regression equations that are used by IRCs. And rightfully, gross ton miles, one would think, would be a very important factor in determining fuel costs, as would locomotive running miles. And if you keep going through, once you find those two variables, you find that there's yard switching and road switching that also contribute to fuel expense for the railroads. And basically that's what we did. We got the unit costs for the gross ton miles, the unit cost for the locomotive running miles, and any switching that would be associated with these particular movements that we analyzed. We added a gross overhead ratio to that and used the movement characteristics developed using ERCs, and we got a very interesting results. The exact model that we used is included in our written testimony. I would note that there really is no reason to use West Texas crude or the highway diesel cost or any of these other indices, because this information exists within ERCs. So why not use the board's costing methodology or the costing data that the board already has to determine, to figure out where we are with respect to fuel costs or fuel surcharges. Essentially, we assumed that the ERCs regressions that fuel expense was based on trailing weight, the number of locomotives used in the movement, and the length of the movement. In our analysis, we found that the cost for each of the shippers that we studied, they were paying fuel surcharges that exceeded the total fuel expense developed using ERCs Phase 2 and Phase 3 data and movement characteristics. That's the total fuel expense. Stated differently, the fuel surcharge itself was greater than the total fuel expense for the movement, while the base rate already includes a component for fuel within that rate. In fact, these fuel surcharges often exceeded by several multiples the total fuel cost estimated by ERCs. We're just talking about the fuel surcharge now.
What was the order of magnitude of that difference?
It varied from, if I remember correctly, 75 to 200%. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. I also wanted to mention that railroads should not be allowed to turn to non-contract shippers to cover the cost of fuel associated with long-term contracts that do not possess pass-through mechanisms. Now, the board on the standalone rate case side has been very concerned with cross-subsidy concerns, and it should be concerned with this, I think, on this factor too, because this practice should be considered a cross-subsidy, an impermissible cross-subsidy. Concluding, the board asked in the notice for the hearing that the shippers and the railroads, that shippers show that railroads were labeling a rate increase as a fuel surcharge, and to show when a rate increase is not directly or closely correlated to increases in the cost of fuel for a particular movement to which the surcharge is applied. Our empirical research into this inquiry shows that the movements that we analyzed, the recovery of fuel expense was in fact greater than the fuel costs incurred by the respective originating and terminating railroads. The board also asked how the reporting requirements of the railroads should be adjusted to provide rail customers with better information on a carrier's fuel costs and the revenue collected through fuel surcharges. We agree with the railroads that the answer to that is the data is already collected and exists in a usable form within ERCs. The board simply needs to add a data output in the Phase 3 process to show what the fuel costs are for the movement that has been analyzed. The railroads have testified that developing fuel costs for each of these thousands of lanes of traffic would be onerous. This is not the case. ERCs could be used as a tool by shippers to determine what their fuel expense is for each of their movements, and they could use this data to negotiate with the railroads. This would go a long way in giving shippers the needed information to assess fuel surcharges made by railroads as reasonable or unreasonable.
Excuse me, your time is up, so if you could just have maybe 30 seconds to summarize.
Okay. Well, actually, I'm pretty much done, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Okay. What about the data time lag with ERCs data? Is that a problem at all? ERCs data is not as it's not as current as you might like.
Right. You usually have about a year and a half.
Year and a half, sometimes.
Backlog, depending on how quickly the data is processed. You can index those numbers back quite easily, so I don't think that's going to be too much of a problem. Or up if you want. It can be done because those indices exist, so it's a very simple computation.
It does strike me that some of these things can be done with today's modern computers, et cetera, and given the availability of high processing computers that the railroads have, so that we have here, and having people like you on board, it should be more doable and not quite as onerous as it's made out to be.
I agree.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm Sandra Dearden with High Road Consulting, and I thank you for the opportunity to present our views in this proceeding. I filed a statement in the proceeding. I'm not going to cover all those points, but I think I would like to cover a few points and also clarify some of the disconnect that you identified, Chairman, today in what the railroads were presenting versus what the shippers are saying. I think the railroad's point of view that they're under recovering their fuel expenses is probably accurate, but what they're doing is they're looking at the big picture and the total fuel costs, where the customers, rail customers who are paying surcharges under the standard surcharge programs are overpaying for fuel. As Awan said, we prepared cost evidence for 4 clients who also filed statements into this proceeding. It's important to note that the fuel surcharges that we used in the analysis were the average fuel surcharges paid in 2005. The reason we did that is to protect the confidentiality of the client's rates. And so because the surcharges started escalating at the back end of 2005 and are much higher in 2006, that was somewhat of a conservative approach. We studied 25 lanes, and in every case, the fuel surcharges were at least 4 times the total cost of fuel on the move. In the CSX filing, I noted that they said that fuel is an integral part of their rate negotiations. We recently helped a client to determine where to build a new manufacturing facility in New York, and they've announced and they're going forward that plant will open in 2007. So in the negotiations, we asked why the standard fuel surcharge program would apply, since the fuel costs that applied in 2001 and 2002 would not be relevant to shipments that would start occurring in 2007. But they were totally inflexible on that position. We've recommended, another thing that happened with another negotiation with the client was when we started talking about addressing the fuel surcharges with that railroad, they said we have embraced the rail fuel surcharges and we need the money because we have this new theme, which is reinvestability. And reinvestability is they need the money to reinvest capital into their system because of deferred maintenance and the need to increase capacity. It seems to me that that is not what the purpose of the fuel surcharges are. In our filing, we have a number of recommendations, and I'd just like to touch on a couple. We would like for the board to adopt some principles on what to do about fuel surcharges, and we would recommend that when needed, and we hope that this can be worked out between the shippers and the carriers, but that you have a mediation process and that reparations be considered when we can prove overcharges. Also, as Awan suggested, the fuel cost should be reported as a separate line item in the IRCS data. And also I'd like to request that any actions that come out of this proceeding also apply on exempt traffic.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir.
Hi. Thank you for the privilege. My name is Mike Behe, and for the past 6 years, our small firm, Freight Resources Network, has been serving the information needs of rail shippers. Now, we were founded by former Conrail executives. During that 6 years, we have grown our customer list to where it now includes over 200 of the largest rail shippers in North America. Many of them are here today. It is relevant to note that our customers make regular use of the information in the STB's public waybill file. In its notice announcing this public hearing, the board stated that in this hearing, shippers and railroads are asked to comment on whether and how railroad reporting requirements should be adjusted to provide rail customers with better information on a carrier's fuel costs and, maybe more importantly, the revenues collected through fuel surcharges. The board goes on to say, making this information publicly available should enable shippers to better identify and protect against inappropriate surcharges and to more reliably forecast their future transportation costs. Make no mistake about it, information does help rail shippers manage their transportation costs. You've heard the shippers claim over-recovery and the railroads claim under-recovery. I want to quote the first speaker of the day. I'm the last speaker of the day. I'd like to quote the first speaker of the day. The Honorable Brian Schweitzer, governor of Montana, said that the devil is in the details, and I think he's right. In written and spoken testimony, the board has heard that highly rated chemical shipments pay higher surcharges than low-rated mineral shipments. Fuel surcharges on wheat run higher than corn. Movements involving railroad-provided equipment pay higher surcharges than similar moves in private equipment. And you've either read or heard other examples, obviously. Yet none of these cost recovery disparities can be attributed to differences in the railroad's fuel consumption. Consistent with the board's request as to how you might adjust railroad reporting requirements, FRN recommends that the STB move quickly to collect detailed fuel surcharge revenue data from sample railroad freight bills and include it in the public version of the carload waybill sample. Now, the board has heard testimony from other witnesses today implying the need for such an initiative, and over the past few months, FRN has heard similar comments from many of our customers. We therefore recommend that the board require the railroads to submit their fuel surcharge revenues for each sampled freight bill, and that this revenue appear in the public waybill file as a separate and distinct data field. Surcharge revenues are too significant and evidently too permanent to continue to ignore them in this sampling process. Now, in order to protect the confidentiality of any contracted base freight rates, we recommend that the board adopt the following reporting requirements. In situations where the railroad applies a percentage to the actual freight rate to determine the fuel surcharge amount, and where the base freight rate is in tariff or public price form, the fuel surcharge revenues would be captured and displayed exactly as they are billed. However, if the base freight rate is a confidential contract, then obviously under the percentage arrangement revealing the surcharge would reveal the contract. The fuel surcharge revenues would be disguised using the same method applied to the corresponding base contract freight rate. When the railroad utilizes a mileage-based method for calculating the fuel surcharge or any other method that may be devised in the future that does not involve use of the base freight rate in its derivation, the fuel surcharge revenues would be captured and displayed exactly as they appear on the freight bill. In closing, we respectfully encourage the board to 1, immediately begin collecting this data from the railroads. 2, include fuel surcharge revenues in a separate and distinct data field in the public waybill file and do so at the earliest possible opportunity. And 3, because timely data is worth a lot more than late data, take every available means to accelerate the processing of and advancing the periodic release date for the public waybill file. Very grateful to have the opportunity to share these views with you today.
We thank you very much for being here and sharing that with us. I'd like to open up the panel again, if I could, for any, not necessarily rebuttal, but an opportunity to speak to anything any other panelist said. You all seem to be sort of saying the same things, but there are some differences that I detected anyway. And anybody on the panel could have a closing statement if they'd like to do that.
I'd like to take that. First of all, Owan, I have the greatest respect for him. He's highly skilled. But I've been thinking about the proposal that he just offered, and let me be a railroad guy just for a minute and come at that from a different direction. I will have the data that you didn't require me to report, but I have it. You don't have it. Owan doesn't have it because I didn't report it. And if you follow this action plan or Jay's plan, you will have more data to work with. Both sides will eliminate the problem of lack of transparency. Okay, so I'll have more data than you will have as we walk into the negotiations. We'll both know IRCs, but I will know more about it than you do. I will know, for example, that the factors that drive the IRCs unit costs are not only the regression results. There are factors embedded in IRCs that go back all the way back to Rail Form A. Equated switch factors is the primary incidence. Goes back to the 1940s. So you're coming at me with IRCs, I'm coming at you with the actual knowledge of whether I over-recovered. Cut to the rail topsy. It's the largest growth area for rail right now, and it's a problem for rail because the profit margins are weak in rail topsy and the volume is growing, and they're going to be pressing hard on this. The factors in IRCs that deal with rail topsy go back to the 1970s, way before double stack. Double stack came on during my watch at the AAR. I was AVP of economics, and I got a call one afternoon from a shipping line. I won't say their name, but their initials are APL. And they began to ask me questions about topsy. And later that week, I got a call from a railroad, and I won't say their name, but their initials are UP. Same kind of questions. And basically, the upshot of that was APL came to UP and said, we have a new idea. And UP said, might work, might not. We'll sell you the whole train. Good luck. And it worked. That meant that the factors that describe the 1970s would not describe the 1990s. So there's a role for micro in this, but you must have the macro data to compute that simple piece of information that we've spent the day debating. Did we over-recover or under-recover? They know, you don't. I'd like to know.
Anyone else?
If I might also just add a few words, and that is what I'm amazed at with this fuel surcharge issue is that this isn't rocket science. This is pretty much bean counting. Numbers that we go through in our fuel surcharge study, this is bean counting, and all we're really looking for is to eliminate some of the uncertainty in the numbers. Railroads submit an awful lot of data to the STB, and from my perspective, you got to know where you are before you know where you can get to. And there's been a lot of numbers presented here today, and a lot of them with incremental cost increases from the base time frame. You need to be focusing on what's the total fuel cost and what's the total revenue that they're collecting from it. Because you've got to know where you are before you know where you can get to. And by just changing, having a little bit more of reporting to the railroads, I think it can be simplified, I think it can be streamlined, and the biggest thing is for both the board and the shipping community to have the beans available to count so that we don't have to be sitting in a room like this all day and listening to two dramatically different stories. We all have to be working from the same page. And anything that can come out of this hearing that will do that will make this, even though it's a very long day, will make it a very constructive day.
You know, it's bean counting, and on its face it would seem to be something that you could do fairly quickly, but I remind you that the highest IQs are not astrophysicists or medical doctors, but it's CPAs. And there's probably a reason for that. It can sometimes be very, very difficult to tease out the data. And what would seem to be a fairly simple calculation, as we've seen today, we have the railroads doing their calculations and saying, look, here's what it is, we're under-reporting. And shippers doing their in fact, the shippers' calculations have all varied quite a bit too. Even those have not been consistent, although they've all consistently said the railroads are under-collecting. Clearly we do need the data, but clearly we need to get the data in a format where we can do our own calculation and decide what in fact it is costing and what in fact is being charged. And my guess is it's the second piece of that might be more difficult to tease out.
Well, there are also some other, you've heard things a lot of different ways in here. The issue of hedging and where's the benefit and loss from hedging goes. I mean, there's some decisions that need to be made from the board side of it, but you still need all the information, and even to be making educated decisions on those things. And anything we do to further that is going to tell us a lot about where we are now and probably give us a pretty good roadmap of where we need to get to.
Yeah. Hedging is certainly a complicating factor. We've had some of the shippers say that hedging should be off the table, that's a risk that the railroads take, and therefore, even though if they aren't paying that for the fuel, that's a risk that they took, and we'll just take the hedging activity off the table in doing the calculations. Others have said, no, hedging is an important consideration, and we should include it. So it goes both ways. You're right.
I would add, with all due respect to Tom, that using IRCs and providing that information to shippers would lessen the asymmetry problem that is really the crux of the matter here. And as a threshold matter, if you can show that your fuel surcharge is in excess of the total fuel cost associated with that movement, then you've made a very strong showing that the fuel surcharge is unreasonable. And if you can show that the fuel surcharge is greater than the delta between what the fuel cost was and basically the change in fuel cost, then you've had a weak showing of at least a weak showing that the fuel surcharge may be in excess of what a proper fuel surcharge might be. So as a threshold matter, I think it really it empowers the shipping community to go out there and find out, hey, is this a realistic shipping fuel surcharge or not? And now should we move forward on it? And from that point forward, I think I would defer to Tom that more data might be required to make a more exact assessment of where you really are.
We're going to put an end to these rebuttals.
It's the last one. I agree with my friend Owen, and we submitted in evidence a couple of figures that show exactly Owen's point. It shows that the percent variance for the average fuel surcharge, depending on the commodity, can be 200, 300, 400, 500%, which establishes the point that you're driving to. That pertains, by the way, whether we're looking at average fuel surcharge for commodities. We selected Houston to L.A., 2 BEAs. We also looked at Chicago to the New Jersey region, one in the east, one in the west, and looked at a variety of commodities. Although we were working at the request of the American Chemistry Council, we found that they were particularly disadvantaged. We found that nobody was helped by this current method. Nobody.
Thank you very much from me.
Well, since Mr. Strege is still in the room, I'll commit to him that we're going to separate the wheat from the chaff. Thank you very much. This hearing is concluded.